Most people will just toss these once they're done with them, but don't do that because they're actually perfect for growing mushrooms. And what's better, the process is easy, dirt cheap, and loads of fun. No need for fancy grow kits or expensive equipment. Now, even though this method is super simple, there is one small detail that I'd pay the most attention to because it can turn this from a mushroom grow into a jug full of bacteria pretty quickly. But rest assured, by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to make one of these yourself, how to avoid making that beginner mistake, and how to scale the same idea up into something like a 5-gallon bucket if you want even bigger harvests. Let's dive in. When people are first thinking about getting into mushroom growing, the whole process can feel really overwhelming. You might see people using all this fancy equipment, and suddenly it feels like you need a small lab just to grow dinner. While cleanliness absolutely matters for certain steps, not all mushrooms require a fancy setup. Today we're growing pink oyster mushrooms, which are perfect for this because they grow so fast. They have these cool, bright pink caps, and when they're cooked, people often describe them as tasting a lot like bacon. Tasty. So in the spirit of making this as simple as possible, we're going to use some old plastic jugs, a little bit of straw, and some pink oyster mushroom spawn. The jug is going to act as our little fruiting chamber. These could be 1-gallon jugs, you could use a liter, you could use a pint bottle, buckets, sturdy bags. The possibilities are really endless. If you are using milk jugs, just make sure you clean them beforehand with soap and water. I would not want to use anything that still smells like milk because old milk residue in mushroom growing is not a combination that I'm emotionally prepared for. The next thing we're gonna need is some straw. I like to use pet store straw because it's already chopped up into smaller pieces. That makes it easier to pack into the jug and it gives the mycelium more little surfaces to grab onto. You can use straw from a bale too, but you'll probably want to chop it up first. And finally, we're gonna need some mushroom spawn. Think of mushroom spawn as the seed of this grow. It's not technically the seed, but it's the living mycelium that's going to take over the straw and eventually produce mushrooms. Now, you can buy mushroom spawn online, and that's probably the easiest way to do this if you're brand new. Or I personally make my own spawn, and if you want to learn how to do that too, I'll have 2 videos linked below that walk you through that entire process. For tools today, I'm going to be using a drill to make some holes, but you don't need one. A knife or scissors will work just fine too. And the last thing we're going to want is some tape, and pretty much any tape will do here. I'll link the basic stuff I'm using down below if you want to follow along. All right, now that we know what we're using, let's turn this old jug into a tiny mushroom fruiting chamber. The first thing we need to do to transform this old jug is to make sure that it's clean. Then I'm gonna make some holes that mushrooms can eventually grow out of. I put 1 hole in each of the 4 sides and then 1 hole in the lid. If you have a drill, you can just drill the holes directly into the plastic. If not, a knife or scissors will work just fine too. Just be careful either way because drilling through a plastic jug and into your counter is probably not the kind of DIY project we're going for. And slicing your hand open would be, scientifically speaking, bad. The holes don't need to be perfect. The mushrooms are not going to care if your craftsmanship is embarrassing like mine, but you don't want to make giant windows all over this thing because the more open it is, the faster the straw will dry out. I would try to make the holes about 1/2 inch in diameter if possible. That's the balance with this whole setup. We need enough air for the mushrooms to grow, but not so much air that it dries out the straw. If you're using something bigger like a 2-gallon or 5-gallon bucket, just scale up the number of holes. And if you're interested in seeing me show that process, let me know in the comments below. So once the holes are made, I'm going to cut the bottom of the jug off so I can pack everything in later. Then I'm going to take a second to cover up all the holes that I just made with micropore tape or maybe polyfill. Now we have our little mushroom microclimate container already, but the jug is only half the equation. If the straw isn't prepared correctly, this is where the whole thing can fall apart. This is probably the most important part of the whole process. Straw is not inherently sterile. There can be mold spores, bacteria, and all kinds of random organisms living on it. So before we add our mushroom spawn, we need to pasteurize it, not sterilize it. Sterilization is when you basically try to kill everything, which is what we usually do when we make grain spawn. Pasteurization, on the other hand, is a bit more gentle. We're just using hot water to knock back the competition and give our oyster mushrooms a better chance to take over. And this is exactly why you don't need a pressure cooker for this process. Today, I'm using my pressure cooker as a giant pot, but you can just as easily use a 5-gallon bucket here. I'm going to heat my water and aim for around 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I'm going to add the straw and make sure it's fully submerged. And you can just weigh it down with something clean if it keeps floating to the top. With my pressure cooker, I just throw the trivet on, then put a bowl on top of that and close the lid to keep it submerged. If you're using a 5-gallon bucket, I'd just bring the water to a simmer, pour it over the top of your straw, and to hold everything under the water, I would just throw a large pot on top of the bucket and fill that with hot water to help retain some of the heat. With the straw submerged, we really only need to soak it for about an hour. And this is a small detail I mentioned in the beginning. The straw needs to be pasteurized, cooled, and hydrated, but not soaking wet. If the straw is too dirty, contamination can beat your mushrooms. If the straw is too wet, bacteria can take over. And if you add your spawn while the straw is still hot, you can damage that delicate mycelium before the grow even starts. So after the straw is pasteurized for about an hour, I'm going to drain it and let it cool. To make sure the straw isn't too wet, we can test the moisture by grabbing a handful of straw and squeezing it. A drop or two is okay, but we don't really want to see any water pouring out. If your straw is taking a while to dry, you can just throw it on a towel, roll it up, and that's going to take away most of the surface moisture. Once the straw is cool and not overly wet, we're ready to pack the jugs. Now, the next trick is getting the spawn to spread through the whole container so the mycelium can take over fast. This part is fairly simple, but it still needs to be done right. So I'm going to add a layer of straw, then a little spawn, then another layer of straw, and then some more spawn. And you don't really need to use too much spawn here. I'd probably use about a half cup of spawn per 1 gallon jug. And I'll just keep repeating this, making these layers until the jug is full. The reason I'm layering it like this is because I want the spawn spread throughout the jug. That gives the mycelium multiple starting points so it can colonize the straw faster, and faster colonization is a good thing. For one, it gets us our mushrooms that much quicker. Secondly, because the longer the straw sits there uncolonized, the more time organisms have to move in. Now, once the jug is all full, I'll just put the bottom back on with some duct tape. Most different tapes are probably going to work fine. You just want something that can seal it relatively airtight. Once everything's sealed, I'll just give it a little shake to help that grain spawn spread even more. Now give yourself a pat on the back here because you took what was once an empty gallon and now it's a gallon full of wet straw covered in duct tape. And I'm not so sure just anybody could do that. Not the most impressive looking thing I've ever made. Looking at this now, it's hard to believe that I once turned my van into an entire house. Over the next week or two, this whole thing should start turning white, and eventually those holes should start pushing out pink mushrooms, which brings us to perhaps the toughest part of this entire process for new growers. This right here is the part where we wait. And that's what makes the steps so difficult in the dumbest way possible, because the best thing to do here is usually nothing. I'm just gonna keep this at room temperature, away from direct sunlight, and let the mycelium spread through the straw. You don't need to open it, you don't need to poke it, you don't need to check on it every 45 minutes. Just let it colonize. Over the next several days, you should start seeing white mycelium spreading through the straw. This is why I think this project is so fun for beginners. I just spent the last 6 months growing both shiitake and reishi mushrooms. 6 months. But pink oysters give you feedback pretty quickly. Once you start the process, you're usually just a couple weeks away from having mushrooms. Oyster mushrooms can sometimes outrun minor questionable spots, but if you see green or black mold spreading, or if it smells rotten or sour, that's probably not a grow I'd keep around. Now, once our jug is mostly white and colonized, the goal here is gonna change a bit. We're no longer growing mycelium. Now, we're trying to convince it to grow mushrooms. To actually grow mushrooms, we need 3 main things: humidity, fresh air, and some light. Kind of. They don't need light like plants do, but light helps tell the mushrooms which direction to grow. The big one here really is fresh air. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull off the micropore tape covering all of the holes. During colonization, the tape helped hold in moisture and gave the mycelium a more protected environment. But now that we want mushrooms to grow out of these holes, we need to open them up. Fortunately for us, we can fruit these mushrooms in a bunch of different places. A countertop, a closet, or a simple tote can all work. For this grow, I'm just gonna drop the gallons in a plastic container and spray the walls to help keep humidity up. I'm not trying to soak the mushrooms directly. I'm just trying to keep the area around the holes humid enough that the little baby mushrooms don't dry out while still giving them fresh air. Once they finally decide to grow, they're gonna move fast. At first, you'll probably see little pink bumps forming near the holes. Then those bumps will just start pushing out. Suddenly you'll see tiny pink pink clusters, and seemingly overnight, they'll turn into fully mature mushrooms. And this is the part of the process that makes all the waiting worth it. Because a week or two ago, this was an old container and some straw. Now it's a full-blown meal. And if you pay close attention here, you'll be able to spot the clues that the mushrooms are giving you, telling you exactly what they need to grow big and strong. While they're fruiting, mushrooms are constantly communicating with us. If they start getting long, skinny stems and tiny caps, they probably need more fresh air. If they start to dry out, meaning the air around them wasn't humid enough, those little pink bumps that started sprouting from each of the holes can completely stall out and just stop growing. So again, we're trying to hit this delicate balance between fresh air and humidity. Now with this gallon jug, I'm not expecting commercial level perfection or giant mushroom feasts, but just to be clear, if a feast is what you're after, this same exact concept can absolutely be scaled up. A 5-gallon bucket with more straw and more mushroom spawn could produce a much more serious harvest, all while following the same basic process. But for this little jug, the real test is whether these clusters are actually ready to pick. Once the caps start opening up, it's time to harvest. With oyster mushrooms, you usually want to harvest before the caps flatten out too much and they decide to dump spores all over your grow area. Pink oysters can move pretty quickly here, so once they look like they're close to mature, don't ignore them. With pink oysters, what we want to look at when it comes to harvesting is this outer part. This little outer edge is known as the margin. And once it starts to flatten, that's usually about when we want to harvest, because if you wait for it to start curling, that's when it's going to drop a ton of spores. As they age past maturity, they're going to turn really pale. They're going to lose a lot of this like vibrant pink color. To actually harvest, all you need to do is just grab the clusters near the base and gently twist them off. That's literally it. And you've successfully grown pink oyster mushrooms from an old gallon jug. This wasn't the biggest harvest ever, but just a few weeks ago, this was a reused container and some straw. And now I'm throwing it on my burger. That's pretty hard to beat. And that's what makes this project so cool. You don't need the perfect setup or any fancy schmancy gear. You can start small, learn the basics, and then grow your setup from there. And if you want to learn how to make pounds and pounds of grain spawn yourself and save tons of money, I have a video showing that process right over here. That's it for today. Thanks for watching and happy growing. Kisses.